In the city of Bubastis, along the Nile, archaeologists uncovered a cemetery containing an estimated 300,000 mummified cats. Not 300, not 3,000, 300,000, deliberately preserved, wrapped, and buried with the same careful ritual process reserved for human beings. And Bubastis wasn't even unique. Similar cat cemeteries have turned up across Egypt, some containing hundreds of thousands more. For context, killing a cat in ancient Egypt, even by accident, could carry the death penalty. When the Persian army supposedly invaded Egypt in 525 BCE, one ancient account claims their commander ordered soldiers to carry live cats strapped to their shields, correctly betting that Egyptian soldiers would rather surrender than risk harming the animals. Whether that specific story is fully accurate or partly legend, the fact that it exists at all, and that people found it believable, tells you everything about how seriously this civilization took its cats. This wasn't casual fondness. This was one of the most intense human-animal relationships in recorded history, and the reasons behind it are far more practical and far stranger than most people assume. Let's start with the practical part, because the emotional reverence came later and grew out of something much more grounded: survival. Ancient Egypt's entire civilization depended on grain. The Nile flooded annually, deposited rich soil, and Egyptians grew massive stores of wheat and barley that fed the population and functioned as currency, taxation, and the literal foundation of the economy. And grain storage has one enormous, ancient enemy: rodents. Mice and rats don't just eat stored grain. They contaminate it, breed explosively in warm granaries, and can devastate a harvest that an entire region depends on for survival through the year. Losing your grain supply in ancient Egypt wasn't an inconvenience. It could mean famine. This is where cats enter the story, and it's worth understanding that this wasn't really domestication in the way we usually think about it, at least not initially. Wild cats living near Egyptian settlements would have been drawn to the grain stores for an obvious reason. That's where the rodents were. Cats didn't need to be tamed or trained to hunt mice. That's simply what cats already do extremely well. Egyptians essentially discovered that if you let wild cats hang around your grain stores instead of chasing them off, your rodent problem largely solved itself. This is sometimes called self-domestication. Cats essentially domesticated themselves by moving into human spaces because those spaces offered an abundant, reliable food source, and humans quickly realized the arrangement benefited them enormously too. Once Egyptians recognized how valuable this relationship was, they started actively encouraging it. And this is where the story shifts from practical pest control toward genuine cultural reverence. Cats that hung around settlements were fed, given shelter, and increasingly treated as welcome members of the household rather than tolerated wild animals. Over generations, this relationship deepened into something resembling actual companionship, and Egyptian art from this period increasingly shows cats not as background pest control, but sitting under chairs during meals, playing with children, riding on the laps of seated figures in tomb paintings meant to represent the ideal, happy version of domestic life. But the relationship went further than simple appreciation for a useful animal. And this is where things get genuinely fascinating from a religious standpoint. Egyptians began associating cats with divine qualities, eventually connecting them directly to Bastet, a goddess originally depicted with a lioness head who gradually transformed over centuries into a more approachable, domestic cat-headed deity. Bastet was associated with protection, fertility, motherhood, and domestic harmony, and as her worship grew increasingly popular, particularly during Egypt's later periods, actual cats became living representations of her presence on Earth. This is a genuinely important distinction. Egyptians weren't just fond of cats the way modern pet owners are fond of pets. Many Egyptians believed cats quite literally embodied divine energy, meaning harming one wasn't simply cruel. It was viewed as an act against the divine order itself. This belief explains the mummification on a scale that's honestly difficult to fully comprehend. When a household cat died, Egyptian families would often go into mourning, and historical accounts describe family members shaving their eyebrows as a visible sign of grief specifically for a deceased cat, a level of ritualized mourning normally reserved for close human family members. The cat's body would then frequently be professionally mummified using techniques similar to human mummification, sometimes with surprisingly elaborate materials and wrappings depending on the family's wealth, and buried with genuine ceremony. Archaeological analysis of some of these mummified cats has revealed something darker beneath the reverence. Evidence suggesting a percentage of the animals were deliberately bred and killed specifically to be mummified and sold as religious offerings to pilgrims visiting temples dedicated to Bastet, essentially an industrial-scale devotional economy built around cat mummification as a form of prayer or offering. The legal protections surrounding cats reinforce just how seriously this reverence was taken at a societal level. Ancient sources describe laws that made harming or killing a cat a capital offense, and the historian Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries later, recorded an incident where a Roman visitor to Egypt accidentally killed a cat and was killed by an enraged Egyptian mob in response, despite Roman officials attempting to intervene on the visitor's behalf. Whether every detail of that account is historically precise or embellished over time, it captures something real. Cats occupied a legal and social category in Egyptian society that placed them dramatically closer to protected sacred status than to ordinary property or livestock, which was an extraordinarily unusual position for any animal to hold in the ancient world. There's also a genuinely practical military and geopolitical dimension to this reverence that's easy to overlook. Because cats were considered so sacred, exporting them out of Egypt was, for a significant stretch of time, either heavily restricted or outright illegal, and ancient sources describe Egyptian officials actively working to track down and repatriate cats that had been smuggled out of the country to other parts of the ancient Mediterranean world. This means Egypt maintained something close to a strategic monopoly on domesticated cats for a considerable period, at a time when the rest of the ancient world was still overwhelmingly dependent on far less effective rodent control methods, giving Egyptian granaries a genuinely significant practical advantage over neighboring civilizations who hadn't yet acquired domesticated cats of their own. So when you put the full picture together, what looks on the surface like an unusually intense, almost quirky obsession with cats turns out to be a remarkably logical chain of cause and effect. A civilization whose entire economic survival depended on protecting stored grain, discovering that a wild predator was uniquely, naturally suited to solving that exact problem, watching that practical relationship deepen into genuine companionship over generations, and eventually elevating that companionship into full religious significance, complete with legal protection, elaborate burial practices, and an entire devotional economy built around it. The reverence wasn't random sentimentality. It grew directly out of a genuine, foundational survival need, and evolved over thousands of years into one of the most thoroughly documented human-animal bonds in the historical record. So the next time your own cat curls up on your lap or knocks something off a table for seemingly no reason, it's worth remembering that this relationship has a 5,000-year head start, and it began with a mutually beneficial arrangement between hungry rodents, protective humans, and a predator that simply showed up looking for an easy meal, and ended up becoming something the ancient world considered worthy of worship.